Hello, hi to all people online, our colleagues, and hopefully our students. Check it. So, as you know, this is part of our advisory board. We already met some colleagues from the advisory board, Dan Allin, Paolo Mancini, Donald Sansoon. Unfortunately, those were online workshops. This one is in presence, so we are very happy to have you here. I won't say that much because everybody knows for her work on the affective publics and now on the state of democracy. Formal role is head of communication department at the University of Illinois at Chicago, but everybody knows her. Her last book is After Democracy, Imagining Our Political Future. I have to say it's more useful for us, this discussion, than it should be. Because, well, yesterday we had a very short discussion that I will expect for today as well about connections between the Europeanization instances and the democratization instances. Obviously, the state of democracy is a problem everywhere. The point is, has become a problem even in Europe due to several crises we had. The 2008 economic downturn, then several refugee crises, then the COVID-19, then the emergency state and all derogations to the rule of law, then the Ukrainian war, then the energy crisis is approaching. So I think that as Europeans, we started questioning the nature of our democratic stability, which we used to take for given. So I think that your last work, which is I can say a radically qualitative work on the state of democracy around the world, can come in handy for us today for our discussion. This will be an open discussion. I'm not here as your respondent. I'm practically speaking being the chair because someone has to do that. So Zizi, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. If you can't hear me or see me, not those of you in the room, those of you via Zoom, just let me know and I'll move. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's especially a pleasure because we're able to do this in person. I will be speaking about a couple of things. Everything's okay?
Yeah, there's some people joining.
All right. So I'll be speaking, most of my work focuses, as Andrea says, on the social and political consequences of the net platforms that it supports. For the past 10-ish years, my work took a turn to focus on structures of feeling or affect and civic engagement. So I started working on something called Affective Publics. I will talk about that a little bit today and related to the work that you're doing and some of your findings, especially perhaps with a bit more focus on fake news, as that is what we're discussing later today. And then I will switch gears and talk about the latest work after democracy. And again, focus on a couple of key findings that are more relevant to the work that you're doing. And hopefully we'll have wonderful conversation after that I much look forward to. And so, just to start with some things as general background and premise that quite possibly are accepted and known by all of us, but they serve as the common foundation, the premise behind what we all do. First, the general understanding that the internet is not a magical space. It cannot create something out of nothing. It cannot on its own create democracy. It cannot also on its own completely destroy democracy. It does pluralize, but it doesn't democratize necessarily. So it opens up more paths to civic connection, but those paths can lead to directions that sustain democracy. They can also lead to directions away from democracy, as we have seen. So we long operated under the assumption, and I think, when I first started studying the internet 5 years ago, we operated under the assumption, the very optimistic assumption that, technology like the internet is here to change the world, and it can be understood as a public sphere, and perhaps it can revive the public sphere. And I think we're seeing, especially with the manner in which many of these platforms are being are unfolded and are being co-opted to our societal, economic, political, cultural ways of living and organizing the world, that the internet sustains, creates safe spaces for marginalized voices. But those spaces are often frequently, those safe spaces are often frequently cannibalized, as Nancy Fraser would say, by extremists, politically extremist publics that tend to steer away from democratic goals. The internet amplifies, it makes these voices, these publics, these voices louder, these publics more visible, but not on equal terms. You know, I like to paraphrase Orwell and say, all voices are equal online. Some voices are more equal than others. And again, I think we have to remember this assumption that we had. You know, the internet is good for marginalized publics. There are all kinds of marginalized publics, and they're marginalized for all kinds of reasons. You know, some are marginalized because they feel insecure, and they feel more secure when they align with principles that are not democratic, that are closer to fascist ideology. That's a very different thing from publics that are marginalized because they're not sustained by democracies, and they don't have spaces where safely they can articulate their voices. So this is a distinction that we must, and a sort of nuance that we must introduce to the conversation. We can no longer use the term marginalization lightly. You know, people are marginalized for all kinds of reasons, and we have to think about using technology in some cases to amplify, in other cases to provide nuance to the conversation, and to provide ways of having conversations that are reparatory, that help bring those estranged publics closer to us and closer to democratic goals of governance, democratic ideals. Oops, back. I want to say a couple of words about affect here, because I'm not sure that everyone listening in is familiar with the term and how it's used. So affect is not the same as emotion. So when we say affect, that doesn't necessarily mean happy, sad, angry. It also doesn't necessarily mean, you know, good or bad or positive or negative emotions. Affect is sentiment, mood, feeling, sensation, its atmosphere. It is the intensity with which we feel. So if an affective reaction, for instance, is when you listen to a song that you like and you start to tap your foot to it, when you are taking part in a conversation and you nod along, not to indicate agreement or disagreement, but rather to note that you're listening, that you're following. That intensity is the difference between me tapping someone on the shoulder versus pushing them versus shoving them to the ground. So we often detect, trace affect in gestures that happen in the physical world, gestures that happen digitally. That difference in intensity is characterizes, for instance, the impact of simple gestures, starting with a caress to the cheek versus a slap to the face, right? It's the same gesture, but delivered with a different form of intensity, reveals a different motivation, different intention, and yields a completely different impact. Translated to, say, news, you know, fake news is much more intense than slower forms of news storytelling that are designed to inform. Fake news even has the affective intensity, the affective infrastructure of a slap to the face. It's designed to draw you in, to get a reaction from you, be that, you know, a thumbs up or a like or a retweet, or just, you know, a general sense of alarmity. without prompting you to think through carefully about what's being presented in front of you. And so in our work, we use affect, we use framing, we use news values. We go by John Hartley's definition of news values as the things that turn events into stories. Because we're very interested in then say, the news values that dominate Twitter and determine how a particular event is turned into a story that is broadcast via Twitter, and how that story is different from the story that is broadcast via CNN, via Al Jazeera, via the Financial Times. What is it about those news values, and how does it happen that we have an event that's happening, yet almost, a sensation that there is multiple different events that we're witnessing, depending on the platform that is doing, that is broadcasting storytelling. That was.
Yep.
And then another concept that we find very interesting is this idea of remediation. Richard Bruson came up with it, and that has to do with the form that events take on as or before they turn into the stories. So in this affective space, very interested in this affective space in which events are being rendered into stories. What happens there? How does it happen? Who are the actors involved? Who has agency? What kind of agency is that? Who has power? How is that power characterized? So we've used this combination of theoretical frameworks to study a number of different things, including news and affective news structures and social, whether social media make or break movements, elections, democracies, how publics engage. I will talk briefly next about this idea of affective publics. I developed this in 2011, 2012, as I was studying different movements that made up the Arab Spring. I was also looking at the Occupy movement, and then I was also examining just everyday expressions of the political online and specifically on Twitter. It was a very different time then. Twitter was a very different medium. It was manipulated, yes, but much less than it is now and in very different ways. And Twitter content was not infested by bots in the manner that it is now. It was a new medium. We were unsure of its impact, and a lot of the movements that took place at the time generated a lot of optimism about the potential of the platform to bring revolutions about, but also the ability, of revolutions, of movements to take on Twitter and use it as this conduit, as this connective platform that would help bring change along. So when I was writing Affective Publics, it was very difficult for me to relay a message that was anything but optimistic. People did not want to hear that. It's okay. People did not really want to hear that. They were very interested in, whether social media can bring about a revolution. So the only conclusion we would usually provide was that, because of all these platforms that we have, paths to change will increasingly be digital ones. And at the time, that was, a semi-correct conclusion, but it really concealed the potential of these platforms to sustain movements that are progressive for democracy, movements that are also regressive for democracy. And it also didn't really represent what we were hearing from people on the ground. In the work that I was doing, where I was studying the events that led to the resignation of Hosni Mubarak, there was a lot of enthusiasm in the West. But in Egypt on the ground, there was a lot of concern, well-founded concern, about what the day after was going to look like. So again, here I want to emphasize, the potential of these publics and these platforms to sustain things that are regressive and progressive. And again, that's not of no surprise to you. But mostly what I want to do is I want to point out that there was a time where we were too focused, overtly focused and swayed by our optimism and by this support for techno-solutionism. And that's really something that we should steer away from. When I wrote the book, I almost felt stifled by that techno-solutionism, that I had the very sort of open conclusion that affective publics can work in a variety of ways. It really depends on how you're reading them and how you're reading current events and context. Now I can give, with a more recent event, I can give much more nuanced examples, and I've written a lot of pieces that update the concept as well. But I understand affective publics as network publics so very simply put, network publics that come together, are identified, or are disbanded, are separated through bonds of sentiment. So what brings people together is not just some well thought out ideological commonality, but rather instead it's some kind of intensely felt spontaneous impromptu sentiment. They materialize uniquely and they leave distinct digital footprints, which means that just because a movement or a public had a particular type of social media presence, a particular modality of impact, it doesn't mean that all movements, all publics will have that same kind of digital footprint. Every movement is unique and every movement has its own unique digital imprint. They support connective, yet not necessarily collective action. And this means that typically, or rather, there's not always an overarching authority that controls the narrative. And this means that sometimes the narratives that are produced by these publics via Twitter, via TikTok, via Reddit, via combination of forms that are online and offline, will be fragmented. It really depends on the movement. So in the early days of the revolution of the movement that led to the resignation of Hosni Mubarak, we had a very tightly controlled narrative that was produced. And that was because there were a number of curators abroad who were fact-checking, but also people on the ground in Egypt who were on the spot immediately correcting what we would now understand, what we would now immediately label as fake news. With a movement like Occupy, the purpose of the movement was not to provide a curated narrative. The purpose of the movement is to present an open signifier and allow people to stand behind that signifier and be counted, to articulate that we're running a form of capitalism that is not sustainable. To reverse the rhetoric and say, it's usually capitalism that says, this form of organization is not sustainable. Quite the opposite. Capitalism as a form of economic organization is not sustainable, is not compatible with contemporary societies and contemporary democracies. So that narrative was very fragmented and confused the media. On the other hand, take a movement like MAGA, that produced a very tightly controlled, very tightly curated narrative. That narrative was not fragmented at all because it was controlled by bots, by bot farms. So there was a very specific purpose to why that narrative was created. That was, in fact, we would say, a manufactured narrative. We could even make the argument that that was a manufactured movement that, took the insecurities of people and assembled them into something that resembled a movement, that took on the guise, the veneer of a movement. Affective publics are powered by affective statements of opinion, fact, or a blend of both. So there's no reason to try to tell one from the other, and doing so often actually misses the point. And these expressions produce ambient, always on feeds that further connect and pluralize expression in regimes, democratic and non, and for purposes that are democratic and non. They typically they work by disrupting, interrupting whatever is going on. If there's a dominant political narrative, they work by presencing a viewpoint that's underrepresented. And again, that underrepresented viewpoint can be Black Lives Matter. It can also be MAGA. These streams sustain publics that are convened around affective commonalities. Their impact is not going to be instantaneous or immediate. It won't be something that we recognize as clearly economic, political, sociocultural either. And that's okay, because change is gradual. And in the words of Raymond Williams, revolutions are long, and they have to be long in order to attain meaning. So it is okay to say that the impact of these movements is symbolic, because there's great impact to be generated by, great symbolic impact to be generated by a phrase like Black Lives Matter, like avec vous, that has a very taken literally, it has no meaning, right? But symbolically, it attains a very different significance. You know, Black Lives Matter, interpreted symbolically, reminds us that despite many centuries of supposed progress, racism remains. You know, avec vous literally means nothing, you know, with you, but interpreted symbolically, it reminds us that together we can defeat forces that work to undermine democracy. The agency that's claimed is semantic, which means that it's generated around discursive renegotiation of key terms that then leads to negotiation of institutions in society and what those institutions are tasked to do. So when we say something like in the United States, defund the police, again, that statement is not meant to be interpreted literally. That statement doesn't mean fire all police officers. It's generated to inspire conversation about how we do policing in the 21st century, because we run police enforcement in our societies in a manner that's not too far removed from the principles that governed policing in the 15th, 16th century, and do not necessarily correspond to the demands of our societies. And the power that is accessed by these publics is of a liminal, I borrow this term from the work of anthropologists like Victor Turner. It's of a liminal, a transitional nature. It can be, it can have stay, it can be lasting if it's connected to structural elements of a society, if it's connected to the infrastructure of a society, which is why we were worried in the United States and I think in the world when we saw angry crowds storming the Capitol building and then January 6th insurrection attempt. It was clear that that power was of a liminal, transitional nature. But because it was taking so long for law enforcement to interfere, we were concerned that there was a structural connection, that there was presidential support behind that movement that was intentional and that was not reversible. So this much about affective publics. Following that work, I decided to flip and reverse the question. And the first thing I wanted to do was, I thought, for a very long time now, I've been studying digital traces of behaviors online, or just behaviors online, and how they relate to and how they support democracy. Let me flip this and go talk to people and see how they think about technology and how they think about democracy instead. And let this be a very open-ended conversation. And let this be different from what people have done in the past, because I don't want to be repetitive. I don't want to focus on a particular city, and I don't want to focus on a particular country. I want to try my best to make this as global and as inclusive as I possibly can. And also, I wanted to take the character of just the everyday conversations that we engage in about democracy with a cab driver or with your neighbor or with a person who's checking you out at the supermarket. I wanted it to have this sort of very impromptu essence to it. But the grander idea behind this was, I was thinking, what if democracy is not it? We have long been looking at democracy as this perfect, ideal form of governance. And the truth is, we've always had problems with it. We invented it to run very small societies. And I'm not really sure, but when we try to scale it up to use it to govern larger societies, we've had problems. So what if democracy is a stage in our civic progress? What if it's not the last point? What if there's something else out there, something better suited for us than democracy, and we're meant to discover it, but we've been using technology in a dated way, in a way that feels like we're wearing blinders and we're not able to see it. But instead, if we were to use technology to build out infrastructure, to kind of like we're building out a railway, then we would discover the next civic stop on our journey. And perhaps there's not just one more civic stop, but perhaps there's many other civic stops beyond democracy and technology could help us discover them. And a lot of people, when I talk about this book, think that I wrote it because of the advent of Trump in the United States, and also because of the advent of other extremist movements. And it's actually quite the opposite. I started thinking about this book while Obama was president in the United States, and I was motivated to write it not because of President Obama, but because I was seeing a number of people who were ascending to office, or even ordinary citizens who had political aspirations, and they had really interesting ideas. It almost seemed that they had landed to the present from some point in the future, and they were trapped in structures, in ways of doing, of being that felt really dated. They just kept trying to incite change, but they were stumbling into these old structures. And that's how I came up with the idea of, who says, that democracy is the best that we can come up with? And rather than looking at books and reading philosophy about what we have said, I thought, well, let me do that, of course, but let me also ask people what they think. And I had this very ambitious plan to travel to, I did this pre-COVID, of course, this very ambitious plan to travel to 100 countries, but the renowned reviewer too in academia stopped me and told me that was a very bold plan, but also a very bad plan. So I scaled it back a little bit and made it more directed and made an argument for traveling to specific countries that were representative of trends that I wanted to understand that had to do with what I saw as resistance to just dated ways of doing democracy. And then for countries that I could not travel to because the political situation was too volatile, I visited refugee centers and I interviewed people there. I had 3 simple questions. What is democracy? What does it mean to be a citizen? And what would make democracy better? I couldn't just, go up to people and say, if democracy is not it, what might follow it? That doesn't really work. I just, had a process through which I just engaged them in general conversation to just kind of feel them out and get a sense for where their politics lied. And because I wanted to have as a representative, a sample as I could. Of course, it's a qualitative approach. So representation means a completely different thing, or rather is a change through different processes. And so I ended up having conversations with citizens from these countries. And I have some quotes here that really just kind of remind us how close, the philosophy of the everyday life is to the philosophy that's rendered and presented to us in books. So Huma Ayer from Pakistan as you know, I asked, what is democracy? And he said, it's the obligation to speak up when something is wrong. And Hussein from Afghanistan said, you know, democracy is one thing, you know, politics is a completely different thing. Hadn't read, you know, Hannah Arendt, but really echoing the sentiment. Citizenship used to be a privilege, now it's a label. I think that's reflecting just general disillusionment with what citizens might do. It's not necessarily rejecting the right to vote, but rather understanding, identifying its limitations. Uzma from Pakistan, I think this is a vote against populism. You elected them, it's your choice. So that's in the context of a call against, you know, voting populist leaders who present as messiahs and promise, you know, impossible solutions to complicated problems. Protest about the important things. I think, you know, just speaking to the tendency in many countries to just kind of, you know, protest about everything. Those who govern us must have an education. I think that speaks to a number of different leaders being elected into office that don't necessarily have, are informed about world events, the economy. Governance is not for everyone. We must raise the standards. Again, the same concern. We all want to be heard, but we must learn to listen to each other. So a call for not just having, you know, I think we have too many debates and conversations. I think we need to learn to have better, we have too many debates in democracies. We need to learn to have better conversations. On cover, it's democracy, but it does not feel like it. That's Luis in Mexico City. This was my first interview. Luis is a cab driver. We had this interview in the middle of a very warm, in the middle of traffic, very warm city, very warm day in Mexico City. For me, it was like, you know, do move forward or just forget about this project moment. Either I get started here or I just keep postponing it. So I just went ahead and we had a very heated, very interesting conversation as we were driving around Mexico City. Must balance emotion with logic to be a good citizen. This is wonderful. I'd love I'd love to get the guidebook to that. Democracy depends on what government does with it. And then here I have a very interesting quote from Khalid from Morocco, and I can't read it because there's that little banner. And once I see it, I'll remember what it is, but I can't remember it now. But that's okay. Basic summarizing, because it would take forever. What I ended up doing is I did 100 interviews, and I ended up pooling all of these responses together, and then using a constant comparative method, trying to figure out if there were common themes that emerged in response to the questions that I received. It will take a very long time, and I won't be able to talk about other things I want to talk about if I went into the detail of that. So I will very briefly say that the general sentiment is that the people I spoke with, no matter which part of the ideological spectrum they came from, were all very earnest and had a very noble desire to be involved with democracy. But they spoke a lot about corruption, which they understood as the biggest problem. And in speaking about corruption, they weren't necessarily naming, you know, capitalism as the chief enemy, but they were naming capitalist structures that are working in corrupt ways as the main problem. And they were also talking about wanting to contribute, but often being caught up in paths that felt dated. You know, it felt like they wanted to get somewhere, get to civic leaders, get to each other, but they were often caught up in roads. The sentiment is like you're caught up in a road that's in a traffic jam and you can't really head anywhere. And so then it was difficult for them then, you know, from this point of frustration to imagine what might follow democracy. You know, we just kept stumbling onto in our conversations with what was wrong with it, you know, were the problems. And it seemed to me that, you know, pulling all these stories together, what people wanted to tell me is that there's these things that need to be fixed first, because right now we're in a We're in a space where we've gone through a number of financial crises. We haven't had the pandemic. We haven't had the pandemic yet, and also political crisis where it's very difficult to think and to imagine. It's in order to, imagining the future almost seems like a luxury. I know it's also a very humbling experience when you interview someone who escaped their country because they didn't want to join the Taliban and they just left with the clothes on their back. You ask them, what is democracy? And they still, they're very vested in giving you a solid response, a reliable response, and being part of the process, and in being included in this project, in wanting to have a voice. So what I ended up doing is I came up with 10 steps that emerged from all these stories, 10 steps that we need to make forward in order to then get to the stage where we're able to imagine what might follow democracy. And as I briefly present these, it's important to remember that they can't happen in an isolated manner. So for instance, we can't do one and then forget about 10, and we can't do 3, but neglect 7. They must all work in a coordinated fashion. As I was saying in conversation yesterday, the solution can't just be regulatory. It has to be regulatory and behavioral and economic and sociocultural. So there needs to be a general ecosystem that supports all of this in order to move forward. Obviously, the first point that I identified was the need to reverse the trend. We have strong capitalism, soft democracy. We need to reverse this. We need to have softer capitalism to support a stronger democracy. And there's a number of suggestions that I make toward that. One that I'll bring up today is requiring corporations to have a civic mission and a civic commitment, not of a superficial nature of, we'll give you a tax break or we'll do a donation and then we'll get a tax break, but rather having, a democratic commitment, a commitment, a civic mission that's written out and laid out in their bylaws that involves supporting the poor or supporting education or supporting democracy in a direct way, distinct. And again, that's not the same as lobbying. I understand that it's difficult, which is why I say that all of these things need to happen together, because then they need to support each other and they guide us away from missteps along the way. Many people spoke about micro-governance, working in smaller communities. They found that to be very fulfilling. So, I encourage that, I underline that, but I also couple that with the need to create and cultivate new professions that then connect micro-governance to meso-governance to then macro-governance, because there's a lot of things happening in communities. They don't necessarily make it all the way up to the higher levels of governance. But if media used to be, or supposedly was meant to work as that interlocutor or as that conduit, but the commercial nature of media doesn't enable that, and citizens have long distrusted media, so that's really not going to work out. But if we were to cultivate a range of professions invested in people who were trained to be civic interlocutors, conversation agents or conversation starters, conversation curators, conversation auditors, micro-community civic managers. These are all things that we can train for in college. These are all things that are attainable with a BA degree. If we were to prize civic professions, civically motivated, civically engaged professions, I think we would be able to provide a supportive infrastructure for democracy on the meso level, where it's much absent. And then speaking of absence, counting absence, recognizing that not voting is not a demonstration of apathy, but rather a rejection of invitations to vote that usually offer citizens binary options, yes or no, or the options that are really not satisfactory or representative. I think in the book, I make the more radical point that perhaps, failing to get someone to vote for you should count as a demerit point, which is difficult to implement and could be problematic, could lead to further corruption. But I think for the time being, it would be enough for politicians to recognize that when someone hasn't voted for you, it doesn't mean that they're apathetic. It means that they are rejecting. You didn't manage to explain your position in a manner that made a difference to them, in a manner that motivated. Sort of like as professors or as teachers, if somebody didn't understand something that I said, it's not because they weren't paying attention or because they don't have the faculties to do so. It's because I didn't explain it well enough. I need to think of a different way to explain it. It's my job to think of a different way to explain it so that they understand it. I was encouraged, when I heard Macron in his acceptance speech saying that, to those of you who did not show up to vote, I hear you. And I understand why you didn't come to vote. And I understand that you didn't vote because I didn't manage to reach you. That's the first time I've heard a politician say that. It's the first time I've heard a politician address people who did not show up to vote. And if you have other examples, please, I'd love to hear them. Long and short-term politics, I think we do this when we manage our households, and it's a simple enough concept. We understand the difference between things that take a long time to accomplish and then things that can be done on the short term. So this is a call both for politicians to run on long and short-term agendas, but also for people who vote to understand that some things take longer and require more steps to come into effect, and other things are more easily doable. And as a result, to not fall prey, to not be trapped by the rhetoric of populist messiahs that promise impossible things. Beyond voting, I think, voting is it's okay, people. Coming up with options beyond voting. I think voting is wonderful, and I think it's still a necessity for many countries that have not reached that stage in their democratic path. But we need to provide avenues for engagement that extend and expand beyond voting. And also when it comes to voting, we may need to consider offering people a variety of options, also abandoning the very tired mentality of polls that invite citizens to offer yes or no responses to questions that have been prescribed and manufactured. We're not really learning anything from polls anymore that's useful for us. A civic education for all, this came from an idea and also in conversation, we all have to, in conversation with some of my informants, we all have to take tests, evaluations, aptitude tests, psychological evaluations for our jobs. Where is the civic test for all these people who we are called to vote into office? Another idea that popped up was just sort of like a short-term civics course on learning a lot of these things. We have a lot of Kamala Harris, for instance, a very promising politician, knows zero about international politics, could be trusted with a number of different things within the United States, doesn't really understand the international stage as well as Joe Biden or other people in the administration do. So some sort of crash course for that, but also a civic education for all, a commitment to what democracy is and what democracy entails. Forgetting messiahs, distrusting populists who present as these people who are going to come in and erase all of our problems. I think that's important in our civic lives. I think in our personal lives as well. And it's funny because in our personal lives we say, you can't expect everything from your partner. You can't expect everything from one person. And yet, when we elect leaders, we want them to be charismatic, and we want them to be very good managers, and we want them to be very, very knowledgeable, and we also want them to present as the person that we would go and have a beer with. And I think this is impossible. We don't have anybody in our everyday life that we're able to do all these things with. Why do we expect to find someone to elect into office who does these things? So temper our own expectations a little bit and not be swayed by charisma. I mean, I think charisma is good, but we need to look at the substance behind it as well. Gaming the system, understanding here that in an attention economy, our strongest path to agency is our gaze. And where we turn to look affords us potentially a nice deal of power. So it's up to us to refuse to click on the clickbait, to look away from that, to look away from thirst traps. Or, you know, I'm not suggesting that we're like pious, you know, and that we don't look into anything that's meant to be fun or anything like that. But at least if there is a thirst trap that presents itself in front of us, we recognize it and we understand it's a thirst trap or a fake news item, and we just ignore it. You know, we don't reward it with an effective mechanism of liking or retweeting or hearting, or whatever it is we do. We use our gaze and our effective ways of reacting very, very wisely to send messages and to game the system and to be a more active player in the economics of attention. You know, our gaze is our power. We just can't squander it. You know, we can't be cheap dates. We have to teach that they have to work hard to earn our gaze. Reinventing journalism, I could talk about this forever. I will just say two things. The first one is there's this flawed assumption, especially in the US paradigm for journalism, but I think it's gaining ground in a variety of different places, and often it's being co-opted by populist politicians that, you know, there's two sides to every story, and, you know, objective journalism, we need to cover those. There aren't. You know, there's some stories that only have one side. You know, if it's raining, it's raining. There's no other side to that. There's also, most stories in everyday life have multiple sides to them. In science, when we want to attain a semblance of objectivity, which is impossible, but when we want to eliminate our bias, there's training that we go through. And when it's impossible to eliminate our bias, well, then we explain how it influences our story, and we make it part of the story. So I think journalists could learn a thing or two from scientists and how scientists eliminate bias. And then scientists in return could learn a thing or two from journalists in terms of telling a better story about our findings. And the second thing I want to say here is that there's this obsession with truth, finding the truth, detecting the truth, protecting the truth. As societies, we need to understand that the truth is not enough, and perhaps it never has been. Because the truth is many things, but it's also an effective mechanism for belonging. We choose to believe that the truths that are aligned with our system of beliefs, and we ignore truths that clash with our everyday comfortable organization of being, with our everyday habitus. So we must remember that. So let's say we found the truth. Are we able to accept it? And then beyond that, in science, we know that truth evolves. So this is something that, and I think we learned that, and we were reminded of that with the pandemic. There was a truth in the beginning, and at least the science of that truth evolved as we learned more about the virus that we were dealing with. So in science, we understand that there are some principles, but we're also prepared, and we have processes in place to then reconsider these principles and to understand that the truth doesn't change, but it evolves. We get to better ways, more nuanced ways of understanding things. So we need to stop reading truth as this binary concept of true versus false, but rather as, and again, this needs to be done carefully and over time, but rather as a concept that's founded in science and that evolves. And in so doing, be our own agents of civic change. You know, stop trying to fit into these forms of doing and being dated. It often feels like we're trying to get back into the pair of jeans that we wore as we were teenagers. And when we can squeeze into those, we're very excited. but it really doesn't mean that we're teenagers. We're just grown-ups trying to get into a very old pair of jeans. So I'm going to leave you, this image is from Wilfredo Lam, and it's called Futuristic Jungle, I think. And the previous image I used, you're obviously in the wrong place. That's from an exhibit from Virgil Abloh. I'll leave you with some quotes from the book that sum up the spirit of what I heard and I was told. You know, perhaps democracy is constantly about disorder and not necessarily about providing a way out of these conditions. You know, we need to get used to the disorder. It's about silence and noise at the same time and constant ambivalence, what I call democracy's fugitive soul or democracy on the run. It's not a boxing match. And this connects to what I was saying about debates. You know, there's not winners and losers, there's consensus. And that is the driver of democracy. So let's move away from all these mechanisms, including polling mechanisms that are meant to divide us into publics that, or referenda, divide us into publics that say yes or no. There are very few questions in life that we can answer with a yes or no question. We can't even, you know, do you want to have ice cream? Most of the time we're not sure about that. Silence is an opinion. It's a political stance. The absence of opinion is in fact an expression of a political position. It communicates refusal, discontent, indignation, indecision. Silence is as important as voice in the sense that whenever we see silence, we need to understand why there's silence, what lies behind it. You know, we're caught up in this mix of nostalgia and aspiration in terms of how we collectively imagine what might be. We're romanced by the trappings of the past. We look to the future with a feeling that, you know, there was something really good back there that we lost. I think we need to get out of that mindset and re-engage our imaginations. You know, the people who I talked with had very lively personalities, but they were constantly called to participate in paths that were formulaic, dry, and boring. Let's reject, let's look away. Let's not direct our gaze to the things that we're not happy with. Let's refuse to order and consume from a menu of civic options that was not created for us, that you know, we just inherited. Let's evolve out of binaries and exist, well, I mean, here, if you want, you know, in the center extreme, my position, exist wherever we want, but in a space that's extreme in the sense that it engages the imagination, it invites new ideas, centrist in the sense that it brings us together. We look for politicians who are trustworthy and reliable, but we do not realize that media operate in a way that often requires a person to play a part in order to be themselves. In an attention economy, our attention is a powerful commodity. It's our path to agency. We have to choose how to focus it. Our attention is our power. And finally here, this last piece about using democratic models and economic models for that matter, that were not made for our times, do not fit our times, feels like struggling into getting into old outfits. Let's be adults, civic adults, and find a democracy that fits us with the understanding that democracy is not something static. It's something that's meant to evolve. And the last idea I want to leave you with is that technology here is meant to network us, but it is our stories that connect us, that will identify us, and that also have the potential to divide us. So let's find the stories and let's use technology to tell the stories that bring us together without also at the same time losing sight of what it is that divides us. Let's imagine a future without forgetting the past, what divided us in the past. You know, perhaps use technology like a bridge. You know, a bridge is a wonderful thing. You cross it to get to the next stage, while all the time being able to look at the river or whatever it is below it, whatever it is that's separating you. So that's the manner in which I suggest we use technology to drive ourselves forward civically. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we don't have a real schedule, so everybody is invited to comment or ask questions to Zizi. I don't know. Good.
I think I have a question, if I may.
Please, then I'll show you.
So I have a question here. You said you thought effective publics. It seems that today movements that move against democracy gain more affection and mobilize more affection than movements that go for democracy. Why do you think that is? Can that be? Can we move against that? And also, on the background of this question is about Europe, because Europe is an idea, is a set of values that does not drive much affection today in Europe. So we noticed that on some of the results. So what could be done to counter this situation?
Okay, yeah, so affect, is about intensity. Affection is about, affinity with something, liking something very much. But I see your question, and I think you're right. I think we're seeing, I don't know, we would need to count. I don't know if there's more movements that align behind non-democratic goals in a very intense manner, as there are movements who align behind democratic goals. I think that's up in the air. We would need to do a case-by-case study. But I do think we need to, I do think that there's an abundance, there's a growing number of extremist movements that are getting behind non-democratic goals that are dangerously close to fascist ways of understanding society, or ways that are focused on eliminating other points of view. There's a growing number of movements like that, and they're characterized above all by intensity. When you talk to those people, there's no ideological foundation behind that, but there is a massive force that is driving them. And there is the sense that there's something happening and they're being left out. And that is the reason, I believe, for the growing proliferation of those kinds of movements. It's insecurity. Insecurity, I think, explains 90% of the world's problems. These are people who went through several economic crises that were felt in different ways, depending on which country you lived in, and were dealt in a variety of different ways. So they have a number of reasons to feel left out, to feel excluded in Europe, in North America, in South America, in many different parts of Asia. Let's not even start to talk about Africa and different countries within Africa. In Australia, in all the continents. So as I traveled the world, I thought that I would stumble upon a magical country that would just feel less, polarized or less alienated, or where I wouldn't encounter these movements where people felt alienated and insecure. And I thought maybe Canada would be that. And absolutely not. That was not the case. And then I think with the experience of the pandemic, we learned that insecurity and extremism exists everywhere. I think that was perhaps the story that unified us during the pandemic, that we turned around, saw people refusing to abide by the mandates of science all over the place for a variety of different reasons. So insecurity, I think, it's financial insecurity. I think there's ways in which capitalism is moving forward that's leaving them behind. They're feeling like they're no longer needed, and it's quite possible that they are no longer needed. And at the same time, it's very easy for them to fall prey to a solutionism, simple solutions that are presented by messiahs, or people who, present like messiahs, like Le Pen or Trump, Bolsonaro, but a variety of different figures who promise the world, but not able to deliver. And people are desperate to deliver, I'm sorry, to believe what they're told. You know, there's my research, but also there's the researcher of scientists much more acclaimed and important than me, like Arlie Hochschild, for instance, who did, you know, Strangers in Their Own Land, many other books. You know, long time ago, Bourdieu wrote The Weight of the World. Ignatieff recently wrote about this as well. That really supports, you know, that, you know, we're at a point where capitalism has reached a stage where it must function in ways that are more inclusive, that are softer, or we're just going to keep seeing the same phenomenon over and over again.
I have a similar question, but we have.
Thank you. Thank you for a very inspiring presentation. I have two questions. The first refers to the 10 points. Of course, which are all very relevant and prominent and important, and I'm sure we have many of them discussed in many of our activities already. But in your presentation, you always express as the addressee a we. We have to do this, we have to do that, and so on. And this is, for me, a little bit too diffuse, because when I go deeper into beyond voting, reading that journalism, very interested in that, very much active in that, and civic education. So all these points are addressed to different ID structures in society and so on. So my question is, does this we a little bit, make this picture obscure where to move on? Because it's getting us together in a group which is not very social. Yeah. So this we, I would have to be spelled out. Question, and the second is a little bit short. We have, I don't know, it's a little slide. We have a strong discussion in view of these populist and fascist. I don't know if you fell upon this notion. What do you think about?
I'm sorry, what was it?
Fortified democracy or the defense of democracy.
That's it.
So this is a notion which comes from different concepts. If this question is not that important for me than the first one.
I think I will respond to the we in a manner that connects what you asked me about Europe as well. You know, I understand, you know, what you say about the we, and often in science, you know, when we write a scientific paper, we don't use the we. It's more of a colloquial expression. When we write a scientific paper, we make very specific recommendations about, you know, what this particular faction should do, what's the recommendation for this particular public. And so if, you know, if that's a conversation you want to have, I'm happy to have like that conversation as specific recommendations are drafted. But the point of the book was to bring people together. And in pulling together those 10 recommendations, I was pulling from things that people were saying, and I was using the phraseology that people used. And also the point that I wanted to make, and I write about this in the book, and so thank you for giving me the opportunity to elaborate on this, is that we often exclude ourselves from the problem, and we want to task other people from the solution. And I think that we need to understand that we are part of the problem and we can be part of the solution. So my use of the we in presenting the 10 points is intentional. I think in fighting capitalism, it's not just companies that need to change. We need to request that. And this is why I interconnect the points, and I say we can't have one without the other. If we send the right message and we reject what's being given to us, then companies will receive that call and will respond. And also, politicians need to do something, but we can't expect people to do something and then leave ourselves out of that. So every single point in there has a role suggested for all of us to play. For scientists, for us scientists as ordinary citizens, for us, we may vote, but we may have thought of not voting on many occasions. For instance, I have voted, but many times when I voted, I wasn't really 100% satisfied with who I was voting for, but I voted because I felt like I had to vote. So the we is very much intentional, and the book is written for a broad public, and it's there to remind us that every single one of us is both part of the problem and can be part of the solution. And now when it comes to Europe, I put the we in there because especially in Europe and the EU, we do have the tendency sometimes to be very specific in how we organize as a body. And that works against us, and we're not very used to using the we when we have to. We're very comfortable with using the I or the you. So the we is there for a reason. And then again, if it gets to the point where the book has, a policy impact, and I get to work with economists, and I have been working with economists for specific solutions, then then we talk about specific policy recommendations for specific bodies. But the call is for everyone. Now, the other idea that you mentioned, I don't have it in the book. I think it sounds very interesting. It's a variation. It's, this idea of like fortified democracy, of stronger democracy. We now have very soft democracy. We need to be stronger. I'm 100% behind that. But it's not the next stage of democracy. The next stage of democracy is something very different. Democracy, and I'll talk very briefly about that. Democracy is a way of governing people. The next stage of governance I see as a way of governing the ecosystem, a way of governing not just people, but governing the world that we live in, including nature. So a way of governance that that's inclusive of the needs of the planet rather than just the everyday needs of individuals. It's something that I call transhuman democracy.
Thanks for a lovely talk. It's a difficult question to ask because, of course, it goes back to the democratic agenda. And I think on the list, there's nothing I disagree with. So that's a starting point. But for me, it raises questions if I connect it with the title of that slide, which is the after and the beyond. And because some of these items could be read as efforts to repair representative democracy and to stay within that realm of representative democracy and fix a series of problems, but to accept representative democracy at the same time. But at the same time, when you contextualize it, you also talk about the after, a different kind of governance model, which might be a different type of democracy, or even a different kind of governance that is not even captured with post-democracy anymore. So I'm curious where the balance is, and actually the real question is, where's the utopia?
There is no utopia.
There is no horizon.
There's no utopia and there's no dystopia. I'm not very comfortable with binaries, but you're absolutely right. Those 10 points are reparatory. And I make it very clear in the book that there are steps that need to happen together, because if they don't happen, it's very difficult for us to imagine what might follow democracy. And even if we're able to imagine it, when we say it, it sounds really, really odd and really strange, So when I say transhuman democracy, it sounds like, I went away in the Silicon Valley with Jack Dorsey and we smoked a lot of ayahuasca, and we are talking about transhuman democracy. And perhaps it's not even transhuman democracy. It's something that, my imagination is limited because I'm living in a world that's dominated by data structures. So the point of the 10 points is that yeah, there's some repairs that need to be made into the system so that, we can just think of it like maybe it's a car, all right? And we need to get here to be able to imagine. And then this car just needs to get us to this point. So then when we get to this point, we're going to have a better view and we're going to be able to see everything much more differently. That's a general idea. You might say that,
I will.
there's a utopian element, and there's like an abundance of optimism in my point of view. And there, in wanting us to go there, and there is, I'll accept that. I mean, I think that part of my obligation as a scientist is to identify what's wrong, and then to propose solutions. And when you propose a solution, there's optimism behind that. Otherwise, why propose it? But at that point, but from that point on, I'm happy to have a conversation. This is a take. This is one point of view on a given problem. It's not, I'm wrong, right, and everybody else is wrong. It's a starting point, not even a starting point. I mean, conversation has been going on for a while. It's a contribution to that conversation. It's an invitation, to take some of those 10 points and say, well, this one is a little bit, tweak it. Or to say, well, you're using we a little bit too liberally. Yes, I am. To make, a very rhetorical point, when we need to make this pragmatical and more practical, I will drop the we and I will design it specifically for specific factions. Are you right in what you're saying? I don't disagree. It's, this is an effort to have that conversation and invite other points of view rather than reject them.
If I may follow up very, very briefly, sorry for putting you on hold. There is a risk of course, being stuck in the repair.
Yeah.
Because one of the problems with imagining something outside democracy is exactly the lack of imagination we have.
Yes.
And a lot of the repair discussions might lock us into a pure evolutionary model that will not allow us to get out of. That's the risk.
That is the risk. And so here, way out of, that is a risk. What in life doesn't have an amount of risk associated with it?
Yep.
I don't, I mean, I don't know what to tell you, except that, I talk with a lot of people about this, about some of the solutions. When I say something like softer capitalism, some of the economists that I speak with, they will say not capitalism at all, something different. Let's call it something different. I've run this idea specifically with Eric Posner and Glenn Weil, both at Princeton, who wrote this book called Radical Vargas. And they're advancing this idea of quadratic voting that's being applied in Taiwan right now. And so when I speak with them, they talk about this idea of radical capitalism. I think it's very close to just sort of, capitalism with a democratic conscience, or with the capitalism that's not simply reparatory, but completely reforms everything. And some folks within their group don't even like the term capitalism. Then you talk to other publics that, reject capitalism for other reasons, because they don't find it, freewheeling enough. So, there is all kinds of risks, in like going in the wrong direction. That my way of safeguarding that was saying, well, it can't just be one thing. It has to be all these things together, because that is a sort of a safeguard. If one thing fails or doesn't go 100% the right way, then there's the other safeguard, the other steps to just kind of shift it back into place. But of course,
Thanks.
yeah.
I have a question myself, but before we have Justin Thoms from Bulgarian University and Vayo Doudaki from Charles University as well. I'll be the third one.
Yeah, another one.
And also Laura Oler from IKIT. Have 3 and 4 women.
Okay, I have,
And then we close.
And that was my guess. But then we have to work.
actually, your topic is something that I'm thinking about, especially in the last 2 months. and of course, in the last 2.5 years already. So I have two questions. The first one is, you had these interviews with people all over the world, but I think that for the first time in the whole human history that we have to find a solution altogether. However, our democracies are not on the same level, which is a big issue. It is. So this is my first question, how we bring all of us through this bridge, how we all as humankind should go through the bridge, although there are many different bridges, of course, and what we find people always interesting as well. But how we gonna make it? I mean, is there a chance for all of us to make it? And my second question is, do we have time? Regarding the, I mean, regarding the war, regarding the climate change, regarding everything.
Yeah, okay, so we have time. We just don't have all the time in the world,
Yeah.
but we have time. I think a lot of people are sounding the alarm bell, and there have been changes in terms of how we vote, but I think we must be very proactive about rejecting populism and then bringing the people who have been hit by the economic crisis and feel insecure and fall prey to the populism closer to us. I think we can't afford to alienate them. We have to find a way to bring them closer. Now, we have all these different democracies, you're right. How do we all make it across? Good point. We have some mechanisms for working together as countries. They're not ideal. They don't always work really well. They don't include everyone. This would be potentially a very, very long conversation. I will say one thing, and then just leave it there and then we can talk about it later. I think the future lies in softer national borders. You know, I see us just softer national borders. And let's leave that open for conversation in order to create the conditions that permit for similar or compatible forms of democracy to function. But that's a very general, broad response. I recognize. I just it would take an entire conference to put that to question.
Thank you.
So my apologies for being so broad. It's the beginning, not the end of a conversation.
Vai.
Yes, I think it's becoming clear, at least anyway, to some of us, that current forms of capitalism, as you pointed out, are feasible to fewer and fewer societal groups, so they serve less and less. And you talked about new modes or models of governance that you call it transhuman democracy. But do you think there is ground, based on the conversations that you have been having, to bring in ecological justice more clearly in these new models of government?
I think so. And there's also, we don't have the option to not do that. I think we have a very short future ahead of us if we don't. But we're making some steps to do it. And I mean, we're a little bit late. Yes, we are. I think we'll have to be a little bit patient because we'll see the results of those steps in 10 years from now, start to, at the very least. We have to be aggressive in taking those steps. And we have to be, you know, when I say that, you know, our own civics of change, I mean, we have to put those sorts of issues to the foreground. Although, again, they are complicated issues and they involve balancing a number of very different and diverse interests. It's not just the interests of, you know, the well-off countries. Sometimes the countries that are less fortunate get tangled up in those conversations and either exploited or, you know, they want to be part of a conversation and be included in a profit-making opportunity that often involves using energy sources that we have labeled as dangerous. So it's a complicated conversation to have, but I am optimistic about it. As long as, again, we just steer away from electing messiahs. I don't, you know, just I think we could do away with inspired and experienced middle management. I don't, do you know what I mean for some time?
I thought it was super interesting to hear how you're engaging with so many different all over the world, and like refugees, sort of tax rights, economics, one in the end for citizens as well. So in the end, we are talking a lot about citizen journalism in the project, of course. So I was also wondering if you were talking with the people about the use of the internet in terms of.
Yeah.
I mean, because you were saying you went to these
Yeah.
questions, and that was not one of them, but I'm assuming you were. But because the internet obviously gives us all the platform to engage publicly on all these issues.
So this was great.
The role of the professional media, how if
Yeah.
professional media can innovate or get the original version of democracy.
Yeah.
There is a role for that.
Oh, yeah, this is very interesting. So I wanted to ask, often because when we have conversations about democracy and what's wrong with democracy, everybody blames social media and everybody blames technology. At least, that's the story that we told. And not once in my interviews, when I asked what's wrong with democracy, was the first response or even the second or even the third. Rarely did technology come up as in social media. Response number one was corruption. Everybody said corruption of politicians, of economic structures, and then of the media. Tremendous distrust in those mechanisms and need to change. And when I asked, and when they talked about, where there isn't corruption, they found that in their small circles, in their micro community circles. So in terms of social media, nobody pointed, the finger specifically at, Twitter or Reddit or Facebook or TikTok, but they did point the finger at larger media structures, media conglomerates, and specifically commercially funded media, and expressed distrust in those. I mean, I think that's part of the problem. You often blame social media, but the story that gets circulated and reinforced and retweeted and then intensified and transformed into fake news or exported as fake news comes from larger media structures.
I have, maybe it's the last one, I don't know. I have a very political question about after. Yes, perhaps there's a separation between democracy and politics. Politics is no longer democratic. Democracy has to be found something else. I see a danger in this, which I couldn't find in your discourse. So that's the reason of my question. Because a very advanced critical discourse about us being after the moment. When it comes to public understanding in general instances, I feel that it may look back in more regressive and dangerous ideas. We know that at least it's going to crash.
Yeah.
We know that post-democracy deals with us pre-democratic, if not anti-democratic context. So, my question for you is there any danger in that? You were talking about fighting capitalism. I had a Marxist education in a public state university in Italy. So, well, this is perfect. It's all about new life for us. That is okay, imperialism, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, there's another big power, which is the state. And many European states would be eager to fight some forms of capitalism. They've done that in the last century. It didn't end up very well. And you were talking about governing the ecosystem, which is something I do agree with you. I think any well-intended people, cultivated people in the world would agree with you. This being said, this is something that governments can too easily use to deprive people of their rights, which is already happening. My country, I have to be absolutely clear with that. This is clear and efficient. My country is no longer African after this treaty. And this is a main danger. Is there any main danger in questioning the democracy, or you don't see that thing?
Us.
I know this is not your fault.
No.
I'm talking about how this can be converted into something else.
No, it is. It is. I mean, I wrote a book about this and it invites these questions, you know, and I have to answer them. I don't know if I can answer them in like 2 minutes, but, look, it's interesting. When I started running the interviews, I was wondering, am I going to bump into anyone who's going to reject the democratic model altogether and tell me these are, you know, short-term governments, you're talking about long-term goals. We were better off when we had like more authoritative states, or when we had a monarch, or we had a king, and there were a couple of people who said jokingly, and they were actually of a very, you know, liberal or left orientation. And they pointed out to me that, you know, some of the world's greatest marvels were created, the things that we admire, were created by monarchies, not democracies. And that democracy is a very volatile state. That's, you know, it's always, you know, on the run, as I said. And that's, you know, where that last piece of writing came up. So I think I think there's risk. Of course, I think there's risk everywhere in democracy. That's the thing. I think we operate under the assumption that democracy is a safe state. And it's also an ideal state. It's not a very ideal state because it's a mismatch it hasn't really scaled up very well. So, you know, I make that point. But it's also it's not a constantly safe place. Nothing is constantly safe. I think we've learned that all too well in the past 10 years. Democracy is about a variety of disagreements and many different forms of uneasiness and stages, growing pains that we need to go through in order to arrive to consensus. But none of this is comfortable because we have to get in conversation with the people who voted for Trump and voted with Le Pen. And that's not very pleasant, but we have to find a way to make it happen. In the course of presenting the book, you know, I was invited at a prestigious Center for the Humanities in Portland, Maine. And there was a gentleman who took me out to dinner and expressed great interest in being my host. And very learned, a graduate of Harvard and all Ivy League universities, living in New York. I would have thought, you know, of a very progressive orientation, Jewish American. Listen to the presentation of the book, a more detailed presentation of the book with great interest. In the course of dinner, it came up that we had a very friendly conversation about the future of democracy. In the course of that conversation, it came up that he voted for Trump, not just once, but the second time as well, after all of the, you know, atrocities that had happened. And I asked him why, you know, in addition to other things, you know, you're Jewish, you know, he's not, he's expressed, he's not very friendly towards, you know, the Jewish people. Also Israel, do you think? He's like, no, you know, yeah, I trust him. I trust that he's going to do a better job, be more supportive of Israel than other people. And this is why I voted for him. And I'm telling you the story to say that we can have reasonable conversations with those people about things that we have in common. We just have to, consensus is about accepting that we're not going to have everything in common, but we have to sit at the same table together and find a way to coexist. And that's not pleasant always in a democracy. You know, it does get ugly and it does get risky. And it often, you know, involves us talking with, having to talk with people who are extremists and making sure that the middle ground or that the consensus that we find doesn't put us in a position that enhances that risk, right? So that, yeah, by definition, consensus is a risky position. It's not a position without risk. It could be a trap for sure.
Okay, sadly, we don't have the time that your talk would deserve.
No, thank you. I wrote a new book and the conversations and the questions that you give me allow to grow my thinking. So thank you.
We have to move to our research, but if we stay with us as our scientific consultant advisor, we will have some.
Very happy.
But thank you.
Copy.
Thank you.